Okay, now, what about the grammatico-historical method as Luther defined it, being the implicit opponent of inspiration? Well, what did old Marty mean? Well, he was defining a polemical stance against Roman Catholicism, which followed the ancient tradition of allegorizing scriptures. It goes back to the Stoics allegorizing Homer, because there were things in it that seemed to depict the gods unworthily, and so they had to allegorize it to get rid of that stuff on the literal reading. Allegorizing always allows you to update scripture that has otherwise become a dead letter. Prophecies which taken literally are long over, even if they were fulfilled. Like Isaiah 7:14, the child being born, the aggression of Israel and Samaria against Judah being put down. All that stuff was long over with by the time Matthew's quoting it to a different purpose. It takes a dead weight material that doesn't seem to have any application and starts rendering it symbolic so we can get something out of it. I once heard a Baptist pastor, despite his protestations of literalism, decoding the genealogies of Jesus and so on, with the supposed meaning of the names and squeezing out some kind of gospel preaching from it. Absurd. Also, if you want Scripture to have legitimated certain things in your church tradition, but it sadly does not do so on any literal reading, you can always pretend it did by allegorizing, like the oil that how about the Good Samaritan? He brings the wounded guy to the inn and gives him 2 silver pieces. Oh, that's the sacraments of baptism and the Lord's Supper. What? And so on. Well, Martin Luther was trying to show that a lot of the Catholic belief and practice was non-biblical, but he'd never be able to win if they said, oh, yes, it is. It's just not there in the literal sense. But like Clement and Origen and all these guys, we know how to get other meanings out of it. And Luther said, look, if you can do that, it's so subjective. You're making the Bible into a ventriloquist dummy. Hey, Bible, you support the selling of indulgences, don't you? That's right, Marty. Indulgences are the way to go. Oh, thanks, Bible. The Charlie McCarthy version. Luther rightly saw, you don't even need a Bible. Just make it up as you go, because that's what you're doing anyway. This appeal to the Bible is just phony. If it makes any sense to appeal to a text, you've got to try to reconstruct the intent of the author. I mean, if the idea is God is telling us things through these authors trying to tell us things, let's find out what they were trying to tell us. How do we do that? Well, how do we do that when we read the Egyptian Book of the Dead or Caesar's Gallic Wars? Well, grammatico-historical method. You use ordinary grammar and try to interpret it as an ordinary, educated reader of this ancient document would have. You certainly will have to read other documents written in the same language to pick up what the idioms were like. And keep your eye on the ball. What? Or if your hand offends you, cut it off and throw it away. Huh? You got to learn to recognize idioms, how they're used, and so on. The meaning of words, do they change, and so on and so on. Older and later, and more recent documents. You got to try to master the language. And the historical part of it, you have to try to understand the situation in which the document was written as specifically as you can, but at least have some idea of what ancient Israel or the early church were like, at least some idea, so you're not just stumbling over anachronisms all over the place. And, of your own device. And you can't just picture the stuff as if it happened yesterday. There's a gap, and you've actually got to widen that gap before you can bridge it. You have to understand how different it was in the ancient world before you can make sense of it and apply it to our day. None of this is controversial. Martin Luther, however, couldn't quite hold to it, in my opinion. On the one hand, he still believes, he said the one meaning of Scripture is the literal one, and yet he continued this hogwash about Old Testament prophecies of Jesus. I mean, none of those are literal. And so he was inconsistent. He couldn't quite pursue the insight, but I think his basic insight was sound. It was just inconsistent in its application. His notion of sola scriptura, that theology has to await the verdict of exegesis. Theology depends on what the Bible writers are saying. It's not the other way around. You don't interpret, or more likely reinterpret or misinterpret the text in light of what theologians or the creeds say. No, you've got to say, well, let me see if this doctrine of purgatory, let's say, if there's any scriptural foundation for it. Let's not start asking, now, what verses in the Bible support purgatory? You will not get out of there until you pay the last farthing. That would work. I guess they're talking about purgatory. Oh, wait a minute. How do you know that's the point? How do you know Jesus is not just advising you to settle out of court? You know, when you're on your way to the judge with your plaintiff, try to settle with him out of court, because if it comes to court, you might lose. And financial debt, suppose you can't pay it, you're going to be thrown into debtor's prison until your family can scrape up the money. Don't take the risk. Try to settle out of court. Or plea bargaining, something like that. And maybe that's all he's saying. That's good advice, right? To say that, oh no, he's really talking about settling with God, because if you go to purgatory, you're not coming. What? I mean, I guess it could mean that, but isn't that kind of an over-interpretation? Isn't it, to jump over to William of Ockham, isn't that a kind of a superfluous level of explanation? It works perfectly fine if you say Jesus was advising people to settle out of court, just like when he gives advice on not being a jerk by taking the chief seat at the dinner table when you've been invited, because chances are you weren't the guest of honor if they didn't tell you were. And they're going to, when the guy who is comes in, the host is going to say, look, Mr. Price, I kind of hate to tell you this, but your reservation is down at the foot of the table. Oh, thanks. Sorry about that. And then in the sight of everybody, you slink on down to the foot of the table. Is there anything moral or dogmatic or theological about that? No, it's just good advice. So you can't be sure on a literal meaning if there's some highfalutin spiritual super reference. And Martin Luther said, and if you can't demonstrate that, that's it. You can't claim Scripture's authority on the basis of it. What about contradictions in the Bible? Well, he didn't think there were any, but he admitted James and Jude and the book of Revelation, and I think maybe the Epistle of the Hebrews, contradicted the Pauline understanding of the gospel as Luther understood it. So what did he do? Try to harmonize them? Nope. He relegated those other books to an appendix to the New Testament. He was willing to stick to his guns. His followers have not been as gutsy. So he had some problems with it. And I think there's two things to be said about this. If you are consistent in applying the grammatico-historical method, you're going to notice contradictions like he noticed between James and Paul, but then you'd better start redoing the canon as he did, and since no fundamentalist is going to do that, what do they do instead? Well, their default mode is to start harmonizing, which is to say, to start allegorizing. Well, I'm stuck with both James and Romans. What am I going to do? Well, they're both part of the Bible. They both have to be authoritative and inspired, I can't afford to admit one of them isn't, because then the mere presence of any text of the Bible would not be enough to make us find it authoritative, right? So they're both in there, but they can't contradict if they're both from God. So how about this? If you, Protestants will say, if you could get James in here after all this time, let's go to the Witch of Endor and get his spirit to come up or down or somewhere, and say, now, James, I got a problem here. It sounds like you're contradicting Paul and saying that salvation requires good works, not just faith. Is that what you meant to say? And James said, oh my goodness, no. I knew I should have put that differently. I just meant to say exactly what Paul says in Romans. I was trying to pat him on the back. Oh, okay. That's kind of what I thought. If you're a Catholic, of course, you would summon up the shade of Paul and would say, oh, no, I didn't mean that. I meant exactly what James was saying. I'm sorry I didn't make it clearer. Well, do it either way you want. You're using one text as a ventriloquist dummy to enunciate the sentiments of the other. What are you doing? You're departing from the literal sense as established by the grammatico-historical method and moving on to some less obvious sense that would not be derived from a straight literal surface reading. Yikes, and they do that all the time. Harmonizing is departing from the grammatico-historical method. So yeah, it really does give it to them. Second thing is that, as James Barr clearly pointed out, though Luther would have been pretty shocked to see the result of the historical critical method that Bauer and Strauss and Reimarus and others introduced, the free inquiry as to the facts of biblical authorship and accuracy and all that, Luther couldn't have seen that coming, and he didn't, and I think he would have seen that as an attack on the Bible. But all of this came about by the kind of minute, literal scrutiny of the text that he advocated. As Bauer says, it's not the real literalist is not the guy that harmonizes the contradictions on the P and the J flood stories. The one who is taking it literally is the one that says, look, I'm going to be as honest and forthright as I can about what these texts are saying, and as near as I can tell, they come up with different estimates as to how long the flood lasted, different rules about what animals Noah could take aboard, etc. They don't agree. And how can I say that? Just look at it right here. Compare verse so-and-so with verse thus-and-so. See? Now, how's he taking it literally? He doesn't believe both happened, and that's the problem. But he is concerned to be honest with the literal reading of the text in the way Luther expected you could be with the grammatico-historical analysis. However, he didn't understand that that would make criticism necessary, that anachronisms would start to stand out, contradictions, redactional seams, and things like this that would make it say, you know, this didn't happen. This may pose as history, but it can't be. Here's why. So who's the real literalist? Barr is very good talking about this. The one that really cares about the literal sense of the text is the one who does not make the pretense of believing whatever it's going to say. Is this an extension of the grammatico-historical method? Well, yeah, I've just tried to explain how it is. But even in the broad sense, it's taking Luther seriously, saying we want to establish what the facts of the text are. Let's not let theology hide them from us. The Catholic theology that says, Mary was co-redeemer, etc. Well, then how could she have thought Jesus was crazy, as in Mark 3? Well, it doesn't really say that. No, it doesn't say his family thought he was nuts. It means people were saying that he was. Come on. It says his brothers, but since we know Mary was perpetually a virgin, it must mean his cousins. Yeah, that's right. Wait a minute. Is there any reason to take the text to say that outside of your hundreds of years later theology about it? Martin Luther, well, actually, the early reformers were Mariolaters too, but the Protestants would say, no, I'm not buying that. I'm not going to find it in the Bible because I want to see it there, but they say, gee, my theology of inspiration, ironically, does not allow for contradictions in the text or errors, so it does not allow me to spot them. It obliges me to harmonize them away. Oh, no, you don't. The minute you do that, you're sacrificing the grammatico-historical method. If you don't, then you're going the next stage into the historical critical method. Okay, if this didn't happen, what did, etc. Yeah, so, I think it is pretty dangerous. Another interesting notion here that you're bringing up with the business about the measurement of the heavens. The point of, and this is a very good example to bring up, the point of the author was that God will never abandon his concern for his people. And a way of saying that was the universe would be measured out before this could happen. And since the universe can't be measured out, well, it's never going to happen. So God will never abandon his people. That's what he meant to say. But the problem is, if this is a divine utterance, why did God allow him to put it this way, since he must have known the universe would eventually be adequately measured out? Uh-oh. If you want to say, now, don't be an idiot. Come on. It's like Jesus saying the mustard seed is the smallest of all the seeds on the earth. Is he trying to teach botany? Again, it's like the example I gave there a moment ago. Moses said, well, Moses didn't say it, but Jesus isn't really getting into that. He's just saying the text says, and this is the one I mean, the one associated with Mo. It's non-postulational. That's a pretty good answer, but it doesn't really solve it. I mean, you're getting kind of microscopic, but I'm afraid you're right. You have to. This raises the issue of the thought forms of the culture and of the writer. Clark Pinnock always drew a line very helpfully between the assumptions of the writer and the assertions of the writer. The erroneous stuff about the mustard seed being the smallest, that's not the assertion of the text, it's just the assumption of the text, the Mosaic authorship. Not an assertion, just an assumption. The impossibility of measuring out the universe, which is wrong. It's an assumption, not an assertion. But that opens the door, as I argue in Inerrant the Wind, to demythologizing, because it's up to you to decide what goes into the assumption and the assertion categories. And Clark Pinnock, who was on my dissertation committee, admitted I was right about this. Bultmann, after all, is saying, look, we know the world picture of the ancients with heaven, earth, and the underworld. We know that's not the way it is. Nobody's going to say it's that way. We know that if you get a virus, it's not caused by an evil spirit. Medicine seems to do the trick, etc., etc. We know the idea of a soon coming end of the world. They were wrong about that. Okay, so we don't hold either their pre-scientific cosmology or their supernaturalism. So all of the statements that imply supernaturalism in the three-storied universe, those all slip into the assumption category, not the assertion category anymore. Which is why Bultmann can say, of course, nobody came out of his grave on Easter. But some guys had visions that ignited in them a new possibility for authentic existence, just like the way the stories ignited in us sometimes. But there's nothing supernatural about it. That is what evangelicals don't want to say. But if you say, look, it's just the intent, the intended assertion, not the assumption, not the terms, which may be culturally or scientifically limited, step right this way. Let me introduce you to Bultmann. There's no reason not to go that way. The historical critical method is the heir, or just the extension of the grammatico-historical method, but the grammatico-historical method, requiring as it does, taking it literally, not allegorically, rules out harmonization. And the presence in the text of outmoded assumptions makes you ask, well, how far do they go? Is the whole thing a product of that?